Did this report say what you expected it to say?
It did. It tried to straddle the middle. It said that, it said what many inspector general's reports say, which is that some rules were broken. But my question on that is, which rules are you talking about? The rules that govern a corrupt president that is trying to obstruct an investigation, who is under a counterintelligence inquiry, who's about to fire the FBI director? I don't know what those rules are, and I was part of internal affairs functions in the FBI. So I don't know what the Inspector General is doing, except doing the bean counting that IGs do and saying, yeah, you shouldn't have taken some memos home, and we're really troubled by the fact that you gave them to personal attorneys. The problem is, it's the director of the FBI. He's an original classifying authority. He gets to decide which memos to write and why. And the question I would pose to the IG is, what was he supposed to do under this scenario? Who was he supposed to give the memos to that he should never have possessed? The Deputy Attorney General of the United States, who wrote a memo justifying his firing? The White House, who's trying to obstruct an investigation? This is an unprecedented situation, and the IG is trying to overlay the rule book on something we've never seen before.
So, Elizabeth, take us through. There's sort of, you've got this criticism, intense criticism here of the actions, of the decisions that Comey made from the IG's report. You also have DOJ, though, saying they're not going to prosecute for them, basically saying he broke the rules, but he won't be prosecuted. Explain what the rationale is there.
Well, he broke no laws. That's the bottom line. He didn't leak classified information, which would be breaking the law. He was very careful with the memos. You can see, if you look at the report, how he redacted some of the memos before he gave them to his lawyers. He certainly did not give any classified information to reporters. So he violated DOJ policy by disclosing information outside the FBI. But these were memos he himself had written. And again, the big question here is, were they his memos, or do they belong to the FBI? The IG said they belonged to the FBI, but he wrote the memos. And I'd just like to point out that because he made one of them public, he said he did this on purpose, he triggered the special counsel investigation. And as a result of that, we learned in pretty good detail about Russian interference in the 2016 election, and also potentially obstructive acts by the president. So I don't see, do Americans think that's not a good idea, that we learned that? So that would be my question.
Well, so let's pick up that question, Jeremy, because that was Comey's justification for leaking this story, for having his friend leak this story to the New York Times in the first place. He had just been fired. He had these memos. He believed he had witnessed conduct by the president that needed to come to light, that needed to be investigated. This appeared in the New York Times, and a lot has happened since then. The IG's report does address Comey's rationale, as I just laid out there. This is their response to that. They say even when these employees believe that their most strongly held personal convictions might be served by an unauthorized disclosure, the FBI depends on them not to disclose sensitive information. Former Director Comey failed to live up to its responsibility. He also says, were current or former FBI employees to follow the former director's example and disclose sensitive information in service of their own strongly held personal convictions, the FBI would be unable to dispatch its law enforcement duties properly. What do you make of that, for what the IG is saying there about Comey's justification for this?
Well, there are two lenses through which to view Jim Comey's conduct. The first is the legal lens, and this report focused on the fact that while policies were violated, the law was not violated. But then I think there's a broader lens. There is an ethical lens, which is, did Jim Comey do the right thing in speaking out about the president's obstructive conduct? Now, the first manner in which he spoke was anonymously. And he did that because, of course, he had just been fired by the president. And I think he rightly felt that if he were to speak out publicly and go to the microphones and explain the fact that the president tried to get the FBI to drop the investigation of Mike Flynn, that, in fact, the president would dismiss it right away because, of course, the president was out there explaining and justifying his firing of Jim Comey. So first he spoke anonymously, but then shortly thereafter, after the special counsel was appointed because of that anonymous speech, Jim Comey spoke publicly. He testified in front of the Senate. And he's also spoken out publicly in other fashions as well. And by the way, in all of his public statements, both anonymous and public, not a single fact has been disproven. And in fact, the Mueller report validated independently every single fact that Jim Comey put on the public record.
Yeah, I mean, Frank, it does seem like an unusual situation. I guess I'm curious, maybe with the benefit of hindsight here, could you look back and see a way for Comey to have achieved what he was trying to achieve that would have lived within the rules of that the DOJ and the FBI had established?
Well, let's understand the context. He didn't, it even says in the IG report, he told the IG, I'm doing this because I could not trust the White House. I could not trust the president. And as Jeremy said, all of his mistrust was actually right on the money. He ended up getting fired soon after he did this. So what would I have done? I've thought about this. There's a possibility you could have provided those memos to the House or Senate, House and Senate intelligence committees. You could have sent them to the IG. But again, the IG works for DOJ and the Attorney General. He did what he felt he had to do. You know, I once read an account of a state trooper who saved a family from a burning car on the highway. His supervisor rolls up on the scene, looks at the trooper, and reprimands him for not wearing the regulation hat that was required. That's essentially what the IG did today. Like it or not, Comey felt the White House was on fire, right? He did what he felt he needed to do. He's been reprimanded for not wearing the mandatory hat. That's essentially what we saw today.
Yeah, and Jeremy, these are events that took place. They're sort of being discussed here. That took place a little over 2 years ago. There's been so much that's happened in the last 2.5 years, but I think folks remember there was the firing of James Comey. There was this story that landed in the New York Times. There was the appointment of the special counsel. This all played out in a 1 or 2 week period in May of 2017. That New York Times story that was based on the memo that was that Comey got through his friend to the New York Times. Is there a special counsel investigation without that?
It's hard to know the counterfactual, Steve, but I think we all can feel better off for the fact that Jim Comey's actions led to the special counsel appointment. And after all, Bob Mueller's investigation led to the prosecution of numerous individuals. It led to the conviction of numerous individuals. It led to the exposure of Russian intelligence efforts to interfere and obstruct our election, and it led to a volume 2 of the report that explained in grave detail the way the president tried to undermine justice. And so I think we are all better off for the Bob Mueller investigation. And I think without Jim Comey's conduct, we may never have had it.
Elizabeth, Comey has obviously towered over our politics for several years now, obviously in the Trump administration for all of the reasons we're discussing. But if you think back previous to the Trump administration in the 2016 campaign, there was that press conference he held that summer saying, hey, there's not going to be charges against Hillary Clinton, but then, essentially indicting her in the court of public opinion, the letter he sent to Congress just before the election in 20. There are Clinton folks who still believe she is not the president because of that letter he sent about 10 days before the election. I know it seems there is some irony today in this DOJ Inspector General report that declining to prosecute him, but then excoriating him for terrible judgment, terrible decisions. That's essentially what he did when it came to Hillary Clinton in 2016, isn't it?
Comey has infuriated both sides. He's done something pretty extraordinary. The Democrats despise him and the Republicans despise him, although they had their moments. But it's, he is... if you read his book, he's a man who believes he is deeply ethical, who thinks he is always doing the right thing, who thinks he's doing the right thing for his country. And he thought at the time when he had that press conference about Hillary that, there just wasn't the material to indict her, but he had to not be political and criticize her, and it just blew up in his face. And he will always be a part of history in that 2016 election, and there will always be a debate. Certainly, there's not a debate with the Hillary ranks about how much he cost her the election. They believe he was a major factor.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.